Hi, everybody. Sorry for the last minute change of plans today, but I appreciate you being on Zoom right now. So apparently I came in contact with someone who had COVID over the weekend. I don't know if I have it, I don't have any symptoms or anything, but just to be safe, I decided to just teach lectures this week over Zoom. So we're gonna have today's class, also Wednesday's class is also gonna be over Zoom. I will get tested after that point, assuming I am negative, we'll resume in-person lectures starting next week. Keep in mind that next class, if you recall last week, we did part 1 of a study if you wanted bonus points on exam 1. And that's a 2-part study. So if you did part 1 last week, part 2 you're going to be doing on Wednesday. So make sure that you show up for Zoom class on Wednesday to partake in part 2 for that extra credit. We're also going to be having a top hat quiz likely on Wednesday. We can do that remotely, it's not a problem. So make sure that you're prepared for that as well. I am recording this lecture, so at some point either tonight or tomorrow, I will send out a link to, I'm going to post it on YouTube. I'll send out a link so that you can watch it on YouTube if you want as well. Okay, so let me share my screen with you guys. Okay, I'm going to be monitoring the chat as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to type in chat and I'll try to get to those. Okay, so just to remind you of what we were talking about as of last week. So we were talking about attribution theories, which are the theories that social psychologists develop to explain how people explain other people's behavior. And in particular, I just introduced the concept of Kelly's attribution theory. And just to refresh your memory about what Kelly's attribution theory is, what Kelly was interested in is when people make internal versus external attributions. And so an internal attribution occurs whenever we explain someone else's behavior in terms of their personality or their disposition or their attitude, something internal to the person. And then external attribution is when we explain someone else's behavior in terms of some aspect of the environment, something external to the person. So this is the idea that I left you with at the end of the last class. One of the main underlying assumptions, I guess, of Kelly's attribution theory is that people tend to behave relatively rationally. So as we walk through this theory, you're going to see that it involves people combining a bunch of information in a rational way to come up with a logical explanation for why other people did what they did. Now, this theory, as I mentioned last class, came out in the early 70s, and it was kind of widely believed within psychology at the time that people behaved relatively rationally at the time. Later on in the 80s is when social cognition really took off and people started to realize the number of biases and heuristics that people had that was like the late 70s and into the 80s. So at the time when Kelly's attribution theory came out, it was still believed that people were pretty rational. And so Kelly's attribution theory reflects that underlying assumption. Later on in today's class, we're going to talk about sort of updates to attribution theories that don't require that assumption, that basically realize that people do make biased attributions. And we're going to see that later on in this class. But first off, let's start by discussing what Kelly's attribution theory is. As you're going to see, Kelly's attribution theory is kind of a common sense theory in a way. What I mean by that is that you're going to see that when I give you a hypothetical scenario, you're going to be able to figure out what's going on without the help of Kelly's attribution theory. There's going to be sort of a common sense way, sort of a gut feeling that you have that's going to lead you to make a certain type of attribution. And so what Kelly's attribution theory is it's breaking down how you came to that common sense conclusion. Well, let's take a look at an example of Kelly's attribution theory, what it actually says, and then we'll get to that idea later on. So let's start with an example. Let's say that your friend comes to you and raves about a movie. They've just seen some movie, they love it, can't stop talking about it. And you've got to figure out why your friend is doing that, why they're raving about that movie. And there are at least a couple of different explanations for this. One possibility is that the movie itself is really good, right? And if you think your friend is saying how good this movie is because the movie itself is objectively good, then what you're doing is you're making an external attribution for their behavior. You're saying that they're saying this person's saying this movie is good because the movie itself is good. That's an attribution that's external to your friend. On the other hand, another possible explanation, though, is that your friend just simply has no taste and likes every movie they've ever seen. In which case you would be making an internal attribution. Your friend is raving about the movie not because the movie's good, but because your friend has no taste and loves everything. It's an internal attribution, right? So Kelly's interested in the question of what determines which of those two attributions, an external or an internal attribution, you're going to make for your friend's behavior. So using this as an example, here's what Kelly says that we do. First off, according to Kelly, the first thing that we do is we ask ourselves a consensus question. The consensus question is the following: would most people behave the same way in this situation? So if your friend is raving about a movie, the consensus question that we ask ourselves is, do other people also rave about the same movie? If the answer to that question is yes, other people are talking about how great this movie is, then we would say that the behavior is high in consensus. As we're going to see, for each one of these three questions, we're going to answer yes or no, which is going to lead us to a conclusion that the behavior is either high or low on that characteristic. So if you answer yes to this question, then that means that there's a lot of agreement with your friend and other people agree, there's a high consensus. So if you answer yes, then we say the behavior is high in consensus. If, on the other hand, you say that the behavior, you answer no to this question, that most people don't behave the same way in this situation, then we would say that the behavior is low in consensus. Okay, so the question that you're asking yourself is, do other people like the movie? I should also mention that Kelly's attribution theory is not saying that you literally ask yourself this question, but rather that you are incorporating this information when you make your attribution, as we will see. So once you've figured out whether this behavior is either high or low in consensus, then you ask yourself what's known as the distinctiveness question. The distinctiveness question asks, does this person behave the same way in other similar situations as well? So in our specific example, what it means is you basically ask yourself, does your friend rave about every movie that they see? Do they like everything that they see? Or do they normally dislike most movies, but they really like this one? If you answer yes to this question, so this person behaves this way in other similar situations, then what you're saying is that the behavior, the fact that they're raving about this movie is not very distinct from their past behavior, right? It's the same as all their past behavior. So if you answer yes to this question, we would say the behavior is low in distinctiveness. And if you answer no to this question, this person does not behave the same way in similar situations, meaning they normally hate movies, but they really love this one, then we would say the behavior is high in distinctiveness. And this is slightly confusing because when you answer yes to the consensus question, then we say the behavior is high in consensus. But when you answer yes to the distinctiveness question, we say the behavior is low in distinctiveness. So it's slightly confusing there, but just keep that in mind, okay? So once you figure out if the behavior is distinct or not, then the last question, according to Kelly's attribution theory, that you ask yourself is what's known as the consistency question. And the consistency question refers to whether this person behaves the same way in all situations of this type, meaning not just do they rave about other movies, that's distinctiveness, but rather do they always rave about this movie every time they see it? So if your friend has seen this movie a few times, did they love it every single time that they watched it? Or did they like it the first time, then they hated it the second time, and they liked it the third time? And so obviously, if you answer yes, that they behave the same way every time they see the movie, then obviously that's a very consistent behavior. So we say that the behavior is high in consistency. And if you answer no to this question, this person does not behave the same way in situations of this type, so they sometimes like it, sometimes don't like the movie, then we would say the behavior is low in consistency. And so basically, after you ask yourself all three of these questions, consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency, you now have a pattern of results where for each one of these three characteristics, you can say that it's either high or low on that dimension. As I said, this always confused me because for two of these questions, consistency and consensus, if you answer yes, that means it's high in the behavior. And for the third, distinctiveness, if you answer yes, it means it's low in that characteristic. So the way that I always remember this is that if it's a C question, consensus, consistency, then yes means high. If it's not a C question, distinctiveness, then yes means low. But whatever works for you, just keep that in mind, that distinctiveness is a little bit different than the other two. So let's see then how we put this all together. So you've asked yourself these three questions. You've got a pattern of high or low for each of these three characteristics. Now, according to Kelly, what you do is you put all this information together. So if you think the behavior, or if you come to the conclusion that the behavior is high in consensus and high in distinctiveness and high in consistency, then that would lead us to make an external attribution. So just to put this in a little context, so here's what that means. So your friend comes to you and raves about this movie. He's talking about how great this movie is. If you conclude that the behavior is high in consensus, then what you're saying is that everybody raves about this movie. If the behavior is high in distinctiveness, that means that your friend normally hates all the other movies, but they really, really like this one. And if it's high in consistency, that means your friend's always raving about how much they like this movie every time they see it. And if that happens, then you know at a common sense level that what's probably happening here is that they're raving about the movie because the movie's really good, right? That makes sense. That's why everyone else likes it. It's why your friend who normally hates movies really likes this one. This movie is particularly good, right? So you're effectively making an external attribution for their behavior. Now, note though that you did that automatically, right? If you're told that everyone loves this movie and even your friend who normally hates movies loves this movie, you automatically kind of know at a common sense level what's actually happening, right? What's happening is that this is a great movie. So what Kelly's attribution theory is doing is simply saying, for you to come to that conclusion, you used consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency information. You may not know that that's the information you use, but at some level, you use that information to come to that attribution. But of course, that's not the only pattern that you could have come up with. So for instance, maybe after asking yourself those three questions, what you've come up with is that this behavior is low in consensus, low in distinctiveness, and high in consistency, in which case we make an internal attribution. So let's walk through this one. So your friend talks about how great this movie is. Low in consensus means your friend loves this movie, but no one else does. Your friend's the only one that loves this movie. Low in distinctiveness means that your friend loves every single movie that they see. And high in consistency means they love this movie every time they see it. And again, at some level, at some common sense level, you should realize what's going on here. What's happening, of course, is that the movie is horrible, but your friend has no taste in movies, right? Your friend just loves everything. That's why, even though your friend loves it, no one else does. And that's why your friend loves every single movie that they see, right? So again, you can see that at a common sense level, you automatically make this internal attribution that your friend likes the movie because they're easy to please. So again, Kelly's attribution theory is simply saying to come to that conclusion, you used consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency information. Okay, so what I want to do is walk you through another example. And the type of example that I'm going to show you on the next slide is something like an example that I could give you on an exam, and you have to analyze it in terms of consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency information. So what you're going to see is that when I give you this example, it should be relatively obvious to you as to what's happening. And so again, all Kelly's attribution theory is saying is how you came to this seemingly obvious conclusion. So let's imagine the following scenario. Let's imagine that Carmen and John are dancing. John is stepping all over Carmen's feet. He doesn't normally step on women's feet when he dances, but every time he dances with Carmen, he steps on her feet. Other men also step on Carmen's feet when she dances with them. And our job is to explain John's behavior. So John is stepping on Carmen's feet. Why is John stepping on Carmen's feet? Okay. It should be relatively obvious to you what's happening in this scenario. Clearly, John is stepping on Carmen's feet because Carmen's a bad dancer, right? So you could just figure that out just by reading this paragraph. You don't need to like analyze it in terms of these three criteria, but effectively when you came up to your conclusion that Carmen's a bad dancer and that's what's happening here, you use those three pieces of information. So let's take a look at each piece individually. So for instance, you might have used consensus information. Remember, consensus means if John is stepping on Carmen's feet, do other people also step on Carmen's feet when they dance with her? Okay, well, clearly, according to this last line, that is true. And so we would say, yes, other people do step on Carmen's feet. So we would say the behavior is high in consensus. Then you might ask yourself the distinctiveness question. The distinctiveness question, meaning John is stepping on Carmen's feet. Is that a distinct behavior for John? Does John step on other women's feet when he dances with them? Okay, well, in the second sentence, it says he doesn't normally step on other women's feet when he dances with them. So what that means is the behavior is very distinct. It's different from what happens normally with John. So the behavior is high in distinctiveness. And finally, you might have used consistency information. And consistency again means every time John dances specifically with Carmen, does he step on her feet? Okay, well, he says right here, every time he dances with Carmen, he steps on her feet. So we would answer that question, yes. In other words, we would say the behavior is high in consistency, right? So when you put all that information together, consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency, we come to the conclusion that, well, if you come with high, high, and high, then that means the behavior or the attribution is an external attribution. So John is stepping on Carmen's feet because Carmen is a bad dancer, right? So the attribution is external to John. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that Kelly's attribution theory sort of assumes that people are logical and rational. We're gathering the appropriate information from various sources, we're combining it in a rational way, and we're forming a logical conclusion on the basis of that information. Okay, is that clear to everybody? Perfect, good, I like seeing lots of yeses, that's great. Okay, but as I mentioned, this theory, which developed in the early 70s, sort of assumed people were rational. And later on, a decade later or so, people were starting to realize that people don't always make or come to rational conclusions, and that instead we're often systematically biased, right? We saw that with the heuristic section a week ago. And so what I want to spend the rest of today's lecture talking about are the various biases, the attributional biases that we make that demonstrate that we don't always rationally form these sorts of conclusions. And I want to do so by first asking you guys a question. So feel free to write in the chat if you think this describes you, okay? So write yes in the chat if you are an asshole. Guys, there's that many assholes. You guys should be nicer people in general. Okay. I imagine, although we've got a few people here, I imagine most of you probably don't think you're assholes, right? I hope. But okay, so let me ask you another question. Who here, while driving around Miami, has accidentally cut someone off while driving? Lots of yeses on this one. I definitely have, right? Okay. Probably most people, right? Almost everybody's accidentally cut someone off at some point or another. Okay. Who here, while driving in Miami, has been cut off by someone? I certainly have. I mean, we live in Miami, so that's almost a given that you've been cut off at some point or another. Okay. So who here, after being cut off by someone, yells, "You asshole," at the person who cut them off? And again, I'll own to that. I've probably done that dozens of times, right? Okay, probably a lot of you, right? Okay, so let's take all this information that we've just gathered and let's put it all together, right? So when someone cuts us off, so we've all admitted we've been cut off, right? So when someone cuts us off, all of us, almost all of us, yell something at the person. "Oh, you asshole," or something like that, right? Well, we've all sort of admitted to that. Okay, fine. So when someone cuts us off, they're an asshole. However, when we cut someone off, which we've pretty much, almost all of us have done at some point or another, right? We've all accidentally cut someone off. When we cut someone off, very few of us think that we're assholes, right? So when they cut us off, they're an asshole. When we cut someone off, we're not an asshole. That doesn't seem fair, does it? That seems a little biased, in other words. right? For the exact same behavior, I'm making a different explanation for my behavior than if someone does it to me. And this is an example of an attributional bias. We explain other people's behavior in terms of their disposition or personality. They cut me off because they're an asshole. But we explain our own behavior in terms of something else. Yeah, I cut someone off by accident, but I was distracted by this other thing, right? I explain my behavior in terms of the situation. That's a good example of this sort of attributional bias that tends to exist in this culture. And I'm going to expand upon this idea in a minute. But before I get there, I want to first talk about an attributional bias that is so common, so ubiquitous, or so fundamental that it has the word fundamental in its name, something called the fundamental attribution error. Because what you didn't realize is that the guy that cut you off last had a crying baby in the back seat. That baby was running a really high fever that morning. And so he was rushing his kid to the hospital. And he was also concerned because later on that day, he had a big meeting about a promotion that was coming up. He had a big presentation to make, and he was concerned about being late to that meeting because of his sick child. And so he had a lot going on in his mind. But because he had so much going on in his mind, he was so concerned about his sick child, he forgot to check his blind spot. And so he cut you off by accident. But you didn't know that. You just called him an asshole. Or maybe you go to the grocery store and you're there with a friend, and as you're checking out, the cashier accidentally shortchanges you. It doesn't give you back the change that you deserve, right? And as you're leaving, you talk to your friend, you say, like, what a moron, can't even calculate the appropriate change, right? But what you didn't know is that that cashier was called in on her day off at 6 in the morning. And she had been up almost the entire night before because she just found out her parents were getting divorced, and she was very concerned about that. And when she got there at 6 in the morning, the toilets are overflowing in the back. She's got to take care of that. And she's got all this stuff going on. She was so distracted while she was checking you out that she accidentally miscounted your change. But you didn't know that. You just called her an asshole. No, you just called her a moron, actually. Or maybe you are walking down the street after a night out on South Beach. And as you're walking down the street, someone bumps into you and you turn around ready to fight, right? What a jerk that someone would do that to you. But what you didn't know is that that person had been drinking that night. They're a little bit drunk. As they're walking down the street, their friend pushed them, and that drunk person stumbled and accidentally bumped into you as a consequence. But you didn't know any of that. You were just ready to fight that person. What's happening in all of these cases is that you've made a mistake. You have assumed that the reason for that person's behavior, whether it's them cutting you off or shortchanging you or bumping into you, you've assumed that the reason for them doing that is due to some sort of internal cause, because they're an asshole or they're a moron or they're a jerk or whatever it is, right? And what you fail to neglect, or sorry, what you fail to consider is that the situation that that person found themselves in was actually largely responsible for their behavior. And that's the fundamental attribution error. It's this tendency that we have, that all of us have, to underestimate the situational forces that influence other people's behavior. And in contrast, our tendency to overestimate the dispositional influences on people's behavior. In other words, when we explain other people's behavior, we usually explain other people's behavior in terms of their personality, right? They did that because that's the kind of person that they are. And we neglect how the situation might have affected their behavior. That's what the fundamental attribution error is all about. And you can see that this is not really the result of a rational process, right? This is a systematic bias that we tend to exhibit. And it's really important to understand the fundamental attribution error, in part because you've certainly experienced it or fallen prey to it yourself many, many times in your life. You probably will many times in the future. You'll probably be able to recognize this sort of bias among all sorts of people. This is a very highly reliable finding. We tend to see this all the time. And by understanding the fundamental attribution error, you can help improve your relationships. Because if you think about times where, let's say that you've gotten into a fight with a significant other or a friend or something along those lines, if you listen to the types of back and forths that go on in these arguments, Usually what happens is you will start to accuse that other person of doing things for selfish reasons or something along those lines, right? So they did something that you feel wronged you, and you say that's just because you're thoughtless or you're selfish or that's who you are. And what you're doing is you're explaining their behavior in terms of dispositional causes. And similarly, they're doing the same thing to you. They're accusing you of something and they're saying that's because you're selfish or thoughtless or whatever. And this is how these arguments escalate. Each person is accusing the other person of something and attributing it to these internal causes. However, if we can recognize that part of the reason we're doing that is because of this tendency to engage in the fundamental attribution error, then maybe we can start to think about how the other person's behavior may not have been a function of their personality, but might have been caused by some aspect of the situation. And if we can realize that and we can see things from the other person's perspective, then these fights don't have to escalate, right? We can have better relationships with people if we understand our own tendency to engage in this error. So let's talk about some studies that demonstrate the existence of the fundamental attribution error. In this first study, researchers were looking at participants' perceptions of another person. So participants were watching a video of someone, and that person they were watching a video of was giving a speech that was either pro-Fidel Castro or anti-Fidel Castro. Now, participants watched one of these two speeches under one of two conditions. So half the participants were told that the student in the speech chose which of these two positions they wanted to take, whether they wanted to be pro-Castro or anti-Castro. So participants watched either a pro-Castro or anti-Castro speech, and then afterwards had to rate that person in terms of how pro-Castro they thought their true attitude was. So the person that you just saw give the speech, how much do you think they're pro-Fidel Castro? And in one of the least surprising findings in social psychology, what you find, of course, is that if you watch someone give a pro-Castro speech, well, of course, you're going to assume that they're pro-Castro. And if you watch them give an anti-Castro speech, you assume they're anti-Castro. I mean, after all, the person got to choose which position they took. So you wouldn't expect a pro-Castro person to give an anti-Castro speech or vice versa, right? So you assume that their behavior reflects their underlying attitude. There's nothing surprising about this. What's more interesting is in this second condition, because the other half of the participants watched the exact same, one of the two exact same videos, but they were told by the researchers in this case that the person giving the speech was told which position they had to take. In other words, the person giving the speech had no choice in the matter. They were told by the researchers that they had to give either the pro-Castro or anti-Castro speech. So you watch one of these two speeches, and then you have to rate, what do you think that person's true attitude is towards Fidel Castro? Do you think they're pro or anti-Castro? Now, if we think about this for a second, if we were logical, if we were rational, then we would realize that, well, it doesn't really matter if they gave a pro-Castro or anti-Castro speech. That doesn't really tell us anything about what their true attitude is, because they were told, they were forced to give either a pro or anti-Castro speech. So we can't use the content of their speech to really assess their actual true attitudes. And so logically speaking, what you might expect is that we would rate people equally, about the same, regardless of whether they gave a pro or anti-Castro speech, right? Because it doesn't give us any information. That's what the researchers expected to find, as a matter of fact. But that's not what they actually found. What they actually found was that if participants had watched someone give a pro-Castro speech, they still assumed they were pro-Castro. And if they had watched someone give an anti-Castro speech, they still assumed they were anti-Castro, despite the fact that that position doesn't actually tell them anything about the participants' underlying attitudes, because they were forced to give either pro or anti-Castro speech. This surprised the researchers. They didn't realize this because they were under the assumption that people were going to behave rationally, right? And so the fact that there's a gap between these two bars, that people still thought the pro-Castro speech reflected their true underlying attitude, and the anti-Castro speech reflected their true underlying attitude, even when they were told that the person was forced to give that speech. That gap between these bars is the fundamental attribution error. Because what these participants are saying, or what they're assuming, is that the behavior they're observing, giving a pro-Castro speech, they're attributing that to dispositional internal causes. In other words, they're attributing that to people's true underlying attitudes, and they're ignoring the fact that the situation could completely explain why they gave that speech. The situation being they were forced to give that speech. People ignore that. So they're attributing people's behavior to their underlying characteristics, their true underlying attitudes. This is the first study that demonstrated the existence of the fundamental attribution error. And so other researchers wanted to look at other sort of methodological paradigms to see if they can replicate this effect. And so here's a second study that looked at the fundamental attribution error. What these researchers did is they effectively created like a fake game show, basically, and they randomly assigned participants to one of three conditions. So 1/3 of the participants were assigned to play the role of a questioner or a game show host. Now the questioner, the host's role, was to generate a list of questions that they knew the answers to. And that's kind of a key in this study, as we'll see, is that if you were a host of the game show, you had to come up with like 10 questions about whatever general trivia you wanted to, but you had to come up with questions that you knew the answers to. That's the key. Okay. And we all do this. We all know some general trivia that we could just come up with a question for. Another third of participants were randomly assigned to play the role of game show contestant. So their role was to simply answer or try to answer the questions that the host would ask of them. The questions that the host came up with, they would try to answer those questions. And the remaining third of the participants were randomly assigned to play the role of observers. They were like audience members. They were simply watching the host ask questions of the contestants and the contestants trying to answer them. So after this sort of fake game show, then everybody, the questioners, the contestants, and the observers, had to rate how knowledgeable they thought the questioners were and the contestants were in terms of their general knowledge. Okay. So that's what I'm going to show you here is each of these three people's ratings of both the questioner and the contestants in terms of their general knowledge. So if we think about this logically for a second, we know that on average, the questioners and the contestants have to have about the same level of general knowledge. And we know that because people were randomly assigned to conditions. And the whole point of random assignment is to ensure that your two groups are equivalent on all sorts of dimensions, including their general knowledge. So we know ahead of time that if people are truly unbiased, then they should tend to perceive the questioners and the contestants at about the same level of general knowledge. And when you asked the questioner themselves, the host themselves after the game show, to rate themselves and to rate the contestants in terms of their general knowledge, they exhibited basically very little bias. That little tiny difference is not a significant, meaningful difference in any way. Okay. So the questioners rated themselves and the contestants at about the same level, which is what we know to be true, right? So they're relatively unbiased, these people. What's more interesting, though, are the contestants and the observers' ratings. Because when the researchers asked the contestants to rate the questioner's knowledge, they rated the questioners quite high, and they rated themselves as having much less general knowledge, which we know can't be true, right? We know that they have to be equal. So what we're seeing is a bias here. For some reason, the contestants are rating the questioners as more knowledgeable than they're rating themselves. And we see the exact same bias when you look at observers' ratings. They're also rating the questioner as much more knowledgeable than they're rating the contestants. So the question is, why is this happening? Why are the contestants and the observers exhibiting some sort of bias here? And the answer to this question is due to the fundamental attribution error. So put yourself into the mindset of an observer. Okay, so you're watching a game show host ask questions of the contestant. And what you're noticing is the contestant's performance is kind of mixed. They get some questions right, they get some questions wrong. But the host knows the answer to every single question. Now, if we think about this for a second, there's an obvious explanation for this. Obviously, the host knows the answer to every question because the host made up the questions, and they had to only make up questions that they knew the answers to. So of course the host is going to know the answer to every question, right? Logically speaking, we can't use that as any information about how knowledgeable the questioner is. So if we were logical, we would realize that. But what's happening is that people are engaging in the fundamental attribution error, and they tend to ignore those situational constraints that lead to this behavior. And they tend to emphasize only the internal causes. So when they see that the host knows all the answers and the contestants don't, they don't attribute that to the situation, but they attribute it to their knowledge, to internal causes. If the host knows all the answers, it must be because the host has a really high level of knowledge. and the contestants don't know the answers, so the contestants must not have as much knowledge. So they're ignoring how the situation caused that effect, and they're attributing their behavior to their internal causes. That's why we tend to see this effect here. And the contestants are doing the same thing. The contestants know that they don't know the answers, but they see that the host knows all the answers. And instead of realizing that's because the host generated the question, so of course they know the answers, they instead are attributing that to the fact that the host must have a much higher level of general knowledge than the contestants do. So we see the same sort of bias among the contestants. The only people who don't show the bias are the questioners themselves, because they're the only ones who realize that of course they know the answers to all the questions because they generated the questions themselves. Because of that, they don't show the same bias. They correctly recognize that they're about on par with the contestants. So what we're seeing here is that when we're explaining other people's behavior, we tend to overemphasize the dispositional, the internal causes of their behavior, and we ignore the situational causes, which is exactly what the fundamental attribution error is. There are a number of reasons why we engage in the fundamental attribution error. I'll give you a few. We've seen before that we are limited capacity processors, meaning there's only so much that we can think about at any given time. This is one of the reasons that we use heuristics when we make judgments, right? And the same idea, I remember I said this is going to be kind of a general theme in the class. The same idea also explains why we engage in the fundamental attribution error. Because it's really, really easy to attribute someone else's behavior to their personality, right? It's really easy when the person cuts you off to say, you're an asshole, right? That's really easy. It takes a lot of effort to figure out how the situation might have been influencing someone. And if we don't have the cognitive resources available to do so, then we just don't do it, right? So because it's easier to attribute people's behavior to their personality, we tend to do so. Further, the behavior that we're observing is very salient. Like the fact that we get cut off in traffic is very obvious to us, right? But the situation's not so obvious. I mean, how were you supposed to know that the guy who cut you off had a crying baby in the back seat with a high fever and had a promotion meeting later that day? Like, how are you supposed to know that? That's not obvious to you, right? But when the situation is not obvious to you, we sort of assume there is no situation that's causing their behavior. So we don't even think about these possible situations that could cause people's behavior because they're not obvious to us. So we assume there is none, and therefore we attribute their behavior to their personality. But even if we were aware of the situation that was present in a given situation or in a given scenario, we don't understand how that situation might affect people's behavior. I mean, if you understood how the situation affects our behavior, you wouldn't need to be in this class, right? That's the whole point of social psychology, is to teach people how the situation affects our behavior. So even if you knew that he had a crying baby in the backseat in a promotion meeting, you might mistakenly assume that that wouldn't cause him to cut you off. You might not realize that that's enough to be distracting that he forgot to check his blind spot. So we may not simply understand how the situation affects people's behavior. Also, as we've seen before, that we're kind of mentally lazy a lot of the time. We don't like to think if we can avoid it. And again, it's a lot easier to make an internal attribution than it is to think about how the situation might have affected people's behavior. And so because we're sort of mentally lazy, we tend to make easy attributions like internal attributions. And maybe sort of an underappreciated reason for the fundamental attribution error is that if you think of the English language, we have all sorts of words to describe internal causes for why people do things. Like any sort of personality characteristic is basically an internal attribution. Why did they do this? Well, because they're honest or they're trustworthy or they're generous or whatever. We have like hundreds and hundreds of personality terms that describe internal reasons why people do things. But what sort of word do we have that describes how people are affected by the environment or by their situation? Even if you wanted to make an external attribution, we simply don't have the language for it, right? When someone cuts you off in traffic, it's easy to say they're an asshole, right? Or you moron, or whatever. We have so many words for that. But what would you say if you were trying to make an external attribution? Like, oh, you person who's influenced by the things that are going on around you. We just don't have a word for it, right? And so we use whatever words are available to us. And because those words tend to be dispositional trait terms, personality characteristics, those are the attributions we make. Okay, so there's numerous reasons why we engage in the fundamental attribution error. But the fundamental attribution error, despite its name, is not quite as fundamental as it might first appear. When researchers discovered the fundamental attribution error, they discovered it in the States. That's where the majority of social psychologists lived, was in the United States, or maybe in Europe a little bit too. Right? In the 1990s, people started to do this cross-cultural work. They started to look at more Eastern collectivist cultures that we've talked about before in this class. And when researchers started to look at these collectivist cultures, they started to realize that in those cultures, they don't engage in the fundamental attribution error in the same way that we do here. And so the name fundamental attribution error is kind of a misnomer. It's not really an appropriate name because it's not quite fundamental. It tends to be mostly limited to Western individualist cultures. And to demonstrate this, here's some research where what the researchers looked at are, first off, an individualist culture, an American culture, and then a collectivist Eastern culture, Asian Indian culture. And what they did is they analyzed all the attributions that people made, and they looked at the proportion of those attributions that were internal, that were personal, dispositional. And they graphed those as a function of people's age. So here's what they showed. If you first look at an American culture like this one, what they showed is that at a young age, we tend not to make very many dispositional attributions. But over time, as we get older within that culture, we learn to make more and more internal dispositional attributions. And the reason for that is because in individualist cultures, our culture teaches us that the reason that people do things is due to internal characteristics, to their personality and things like that. So the more time you spend in this culture, the more you learn to make these internal attributions. But if you look at a collectivist culture like this Asian Indian culture, and you do the same thing, what you show is that although they start at roughly the same point, at a young age, they don't make very many personal attributions. Over time, they don't tend to make that many more personal attributions because they come from a collectivist culture. And in collectivist cultures, they teach that people's behavior is largely a function of their situation, their environment. Remember that collectivist cultures focus on the interconnectedness of people, right? What that basically means is they focus on how we're connected with our environment. So they understand that sometimes the situation, the context can affect our behavior. So in those cultures, they don't teach that the result of behavior is purely a function of these personal characteristics like we do in this culture. As a consequence, in these more Eastern collectivist cultures, they tend not to show the fundamental attribution error as much because they're not making these internal attributions because that's not what they've learned from their culture. On the other hand, if you look not at the proportion of these internal attributions that people make, like I'm showing here, but you look at the proportion of situational attributions or external attributions that people make, what you find is the exact opposite. So if you look at an American culture, we tend not to make more situational attributions as we get older and older and the more time we spend in a culture. Again, because our culture doesn't emphasize how the situation affects our behavior. But if you look at these collectivist cultures, what you find is, again, they start off at roughly the same point as people in individualist cultures in terms of proportion of situational attributions they make. But they learn over time to make more and more situational attributions because that's what their culture emphasizes, is that the reason people do things is due to the context and the situation in which they find themselves. So because of these findings, researchers have sort of realized that the name fundamental attribution error is not really appropriate. And so some researchers have changed the name of this bias to something called the correspondence bias, to sort of de-emphasize this mistaken idea that this is fundamental. That being said, for historic reasons, more people know this bias as the fundamental attribution error. So despite the fact that it's not really fundamental, it still tends to be called fundamental attribution error. So what this is all showing is that we tend to overestimate the dispositional causes of other people's behavior. We explain other people's behavior in terms of their personality. But there are also times where we need to explain our own behavior. Why did we do something? And if we were being fair and unbiased, well, if we're going to tend to emphasize the internal causes of other people's behavior, then we should tend to emphasize the internal causes of our own behavior too, right? But that's not what we do. As you know, when other people cut you off, they're assholes, right? That's an internal attribution. When you cut them off, though, you're not an asshole. You did it because you were distracted or whatever it was, right? In other words, you make different attributions for yourself than you do for other people. You make situational attributions for yourself, but you make dispositional attributions for other people. And that bias, that difference between the attributions we make for ourselves versus other people, is known as the actor-observer effect. This is the second attributional bias that I want to talk about today. Okay, now, a lot of people get confused between the difference between the fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer effect. So I want to be very explicit on this. The fundamental attribution error only refers to how we make attributions for other people. And it says that we overestimate the internal causes of their behavior, and we underestimate the situational causes of their behavior. Okay? The actor-observer effect says that although we do that for other people, we don't do that for ourselves. Other people's behavior, we say, is the result of their internal causes, dispositional causes, but our behaviors are an effect of the situation we find ourselves in. Okay, so the actor-observer effect refers to the different types of attributions we make for other people versus ourselves. So for instance, if you trip, it's because you're clumsy. That's what I would say if I'm making an internal attribution for your behavior. But if I engage in the exact same behavior and I trip, it's because something got in my way. I blame an external source for my behavior. You can also see, by the way, I'm just going to link this to what we talked about earlier in the course. So we talked about this general theme that we have, that we want to think really highly of ourselves. Well, this sort of plays into that as well, because we have this tendency to want to explain our own undesirable behaviors in terms of the situation. Because if we explain them in terms of our personality, that would hurt our self-esteem, right? So we make excuses for our own undesirable behavior. So we explain it in terms of the situation, but we don't feel a need to do that for other people, which is why we can make dispositional attributions for them. So part of the reason the actor-observer effect exists is related to this idea that we like to have really high self-esteem about ourselves. There are a number of examples of the actor-observer effect. So I'll give you three. So for instance, some research looked at prison inmates, and particularly they looked at the excuses, or I shouldn't say excuses. They looked at prisoners' reasons why they thought they ended up in jail. Okay, so maybe someone's in jail for armed robbery or something. And what they showed is that when you interview the inmates tend to make situational attributions for themselves. They tend to say things like, you know, I was out drinking with a friend, and the friend was pressuring me to rob people, and so it kind of forced me to do it, something along those lines, right? They're making situational attributions for their own behavior. But when the researchers interviewed the counselors of those inmates, the counselors made different explanations for the inmates' behavior. In particular, the counselors tended to explain the inmates' behavior in terms of their personality and their disposition. That's the type of person they are. They're a violent, aggressive person by nature, which is what led them to this. So you can see that the explanations the inmates made for themselves were different from the explanations the counselors made for the inmates, consistent with the actor-observer effect. Some other researchers did an analysis of Dear Abby letters. So these were letters that people would write to Abby, and Abby would give advice. So people would write in with some sort of problem they're having, and then Abby would respond in her Dear Abby column with what you should do. And so what some researchers did is they analyzed some letters that people wrote into Dear Abby. And what they showed is that within those letters, people tended to make, when they're explaining their own behavior, they tended to make dispositional explanations. Or sorry, when they were explaining other people's behavior, they tended to make internal dispositional attributions. But when they were explaining their own behavior, they tended to make more situational, external attributions. So again, consistent with the actor-observer effect. A third study looked at the attributions that college students made for themselves versus for their roommates. So what they would do is they would take college roommates, separate them, and individually they would ask each one. They would give them like a list of let's say personality traits, things like trustworthy, honest, things like that. And you'd have to rate yourself in terms of how often you exhibit that trait, and also your roommate. How often does your roommate exhibit that trait? And what they showed is that when people explain other people's behavior, they tend to explain it in terms of these concrete dispositional internal traits. So what they would say is things like, how often does your roommate exhibit trustworthiness? And then people would say, oh yeah, they're a trustworthy person all the time, or they're not a trustworthy person at all. And they're always like that. But when people had to explain their own behavior, so when they had to make the same judgments for themselves on something like trustworthiness, they would say things like, well, it sort of depends. With some people, I'm trustworthy. With other people, I'm less trustworthy. Or maybe they're given the word honest. Sometimes I'm honest, like with my friends, I'm honest. With my family, I'm not so honest. But my roommate, they're always honest, or they're always dishonest. So whenever they're explaining other people's behavior, they're always the same way. We don't recognize how the situation might affect whether people are honest or trustworthy. But for ourselves, we recognize that. For ourselves, everything depends on the situation that we're in. So we can understand how the situation might affect us, but not how it might affect our roommates or other people. So one thing we get from the actor-observer effect is that when we make attributions, we're not only making attributions for other people, we also make attributions for our own behavior, right? And that those attributions can be biased. And the third attributional bias that I want to talk about today is also related to this idea that we're often biased when we make attributions about our own behavior. This is based on something known as the overjustification effect. The basic idea behind the overjustification effect is that if there's some sort of activity that you like doing, and you can think of basically any hobby that you have that you like doing for fun. Maybe that's playing an instrument, maybe it's playing a sport, maybe it's singing or dancing or painting or whatever it is that you do, whatever you like to do for fun, whatever your hobby is. If you intrinsically like doing that activity, if you start to receive some extrinsic reward for performing that activity, so for instance, you start to get paid, you start to get money for performing that activity, then the act of getting paid tends to undermine our intrinsic motivation. So if you really like to paint, you're an artist, you inherently like to do it, and you make that your profession, you start to get paid to paint, you start to like painting less over time. That's what the overjustification effect says. And the reason this occurs is due to an attributional bias that we make about ourselves, as I will explain. Let me give you an example of a famous study that looked at this, and then we'll talk about the reasons why this happens. So in this study, researchers went to a school, I think it was like a grade school. And they went to this grade school on 3 consecutive days. On day 1, they show up to the school and they have all these colored markers with them. And they allow the kids to play with the colored markers as much as they want. And for the most part, the kids like these colored markers, right? They play with them a lot. This was just a demonstration that the kids really like playing with the markers, right? And this is established on day 1. On day 2, the researchers come back, and on day 2, they randomly assign these kids to one of 3 conditions. In one condition, the control condition, the kids are allowed to play with the markers as much as they want on day 2, just like on day 1. In a second condition, the kids are told that in the morning, when the researchers come in, that if they play with the markers over the course of the day, then at the end of the day, they're going to receive a reward. They're going to receive a blue ribbon and a good player certificate. So that's the expected reward condition. These kids know that if they play with the markers, they'll receive this reward. In a third condition, what's called the unexpected reward condition, the kids are allowed to play with the markers as much as they want. And at the end of the day, they get a surprise reward. And the surprise is the blue ribbon and the good player certificate. So we've got 3 conditions: the no reward condition, the expected reward condition, and the unexpected reward condition. That's all on day 2. The researchers come back on day 3. And on day 3, all the kids are treated exactly the same again. So the researchers allow the kids to play with the markers as much as they want, and no kid gets any reward at all for playing with the markers. Now, what the researchers want to know is, do these kids still like playing with markers on day 3? And so what they do is they measure the proportion of the time that the kids spend playing with these markers. The more time they spend playing with the markers, the more they must enjoy them, right? So what I'm going to show you on this slide here is the percent of time the kids play with the markers on day 3. This is basically a measure of their intrinsic interest in the markers, how much they enjoy playing with them. And I'm going to show you that as a function of what condition they were in on day 2, whether they got no reward, an unexpected reward, or an expected reward. We're going to start on the right side of this graph and work our way left. Here's what they show. In the no reward condition, the kids who were never rewarded on day 2, then on day 3, they still like playing with the markers, right? They still, in other words, show this tendency, this intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. They still like it. Okay. In the unexpected reward condition, the kids who got a surprise reward on day 2. So they played with the markers on day 2, they got a surprise reward on day 2, then the researchers come back on day 3. They still play with the markers a lot on day 3. They still really like playing with the markers. The most interesting condition, the critical condition for our purposes, is this expected reward condition, this last condition here. These are the kids who on day 2 were told in the morning that if you play with the markers, you will get a reward. So they played with the markers, they got a reward. On day 3, the researchers came back and said, here are the markers, you can play with them as much as you want. And suddenly those kids don't really want to play with the markers anymore. They've lost their intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. This is what the overjustification effect is that once you start to get this extrinsic reward on day 2, that undermines your intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. And to understand why this is the case, let's put ourselves into the mindset of these kids, in particular, the expected reward kids, okay? So just to refresh your memory. So day 1, you're allowed to play with the markers as much as you want. You really like playing with markers. Day 2, the researchers come in and say, if you play with the markers, you will get a reward. Okay, so you play with the markers, you get a reward at the end of the day. Day 3, the researchers come back and say, here are the markers, you can play with them as much as you want. Now, you start thinking to yourself, okay, how much do I want to play with these markers? Well, let's see. Yesterday, I played with the markers, but I was told I was going to get a reward to play with them. So I must have only played with them because I expected to get that reward. And if I'm not getting a reward today, why would I play with these markers? In other words, they came to the conclusion that the only reason they played with the markers yesterday is because of the reward. Now, that wasn't true. They played with them because they really enjoyed playing with them, right? But they came to that wrong conclusion that they only played with them for the reward. And so if they're not being rewarded for the markers today, why would they play with them? But note that that doesn't happen for the kids in the unexpected reward condition, because these kids on day 3 are thinking the same thing. How much do I like playing with these markers? Well, yesterday I played with markers and I got a reward for it, but I didn't know I was getting a reward for playing with the markers. So at the time I was playing with them, I obviously didn't do it for the reward because I didn't know I was getting one. So I must have played with them because I really liked it. So therefore, I guess I must really like playing with markers still. So what's happening here is an attributional bias. The kids in the expected reward condition are mistakenly attributing their past behavior to an external cause as opposed to an internal cause. They're mistakenly believing that they only played with the markers because they got the reward, not because they inherently like them. And because they came to that wrong conclusion, that wrong attribution for that behavior, that undermined their intrinsic motivation to play with the markers. This is actually very similar to self-perception theory, which we saw earlier. Remember that self-perception theory says that when you don't know your true attitude towards something, we think about our past behavior and we come to a rational conclusion about what our attitude must be based on our past behavior. And that's exactly what these kids are doing. They didn't have this introspective access, right? So we've talked about that before, that we don't really have this introspective awareness necessarily of how much we like something. And that's what's happening with these kids. If these kids knew that they really like playing with the markers, they would never show the overjustification effect. They would correctly figure out that I still really like playing with the markers. But because we don't have that introspective awareness, but we rely on things like self-perception theory to figure out what our attitude must be, they start thinking about their past behavior and coming to a conclusion about what their attitude must be, but that conclusion is completely mistaken. So this is an attributional bias that we're seeing when people make attributions for their own behavior. And this can occur with us as well. It's kind of like if you really like doing something and you start to get paid for it, that thing starts to feel like work all of a sudden. And so if you stop getting paid for it, it feels like you're doing the work without actually getting paid for it. And so we don't really want to do that anymore. So the extrinsic reward has undermined our intrinsic motivation. So effectively what's happening here is that the kids are coming up to this thought process. I must be playing with markers because I got the reward, not because I like them. So if I'm not getting a reward anymore, I don't want to play with the markers anymore. So the extrinsic reward changed people's attributions, in other words. Just like when something becomes an obligation, sort of, yes, kind of. That's kind of an idea that if something you really liked started to become an obligation, that we think we're only doing it because of the obligation, so we don't really want to do it anymore. It's similar to that. Oops. There's a story that I think it's in your textbooks that goes like this. I don't know if it's true or not, but the story is about a man who had a problem because this man owned a business, and this business had these really large plate glass windows in the front. And the problem was that these kids were coming along and throwing rocks through his windows. And he had to figure out a way to get the kids to stop doing this. Now, I think most of us, if we were faced with the same problem, our solution would be to go yell at the kids, right? To get them to stop throwing rocks through the windows. But this guy was a little more clever. He used some social psychology knowledge to trick the kids into not breaking his windows. So here's what he did. The next time the kids came with the rocks to throw through the windows, he ran out to them and he said, hey, you're not in trouble. In fact, I really like what you're doing. I want you to break my windows. In fact, I want you to break my windows so much that if you come back tomorrow and you break my windows, I'll pay you each a quarter. And the kids think, well, you know, we're going to break your windows for free, so we might as well get paid for it, right? So they leave, they come back, they throw rocks at the guy's windows again. The shop owner runs out. He says, I love what you guys are doing. Here's a quarter each. I love it so much. I want you to come back tomorrow and break my windows. The problem is I don't have as much money, but I can pay you a dime each if you break my windows. So the kids say, okay, well, it's better than nothing. So they leave, they come back the next day, and they start throwing rocks through his windows again. Again, the man runs out to them, says, I love what you guys are doing. Here's a dime for each of you. Again, I love it so much. I want you guys to come back tomorrow and break my windows again. The only problem is I don't have any more money left, but I would love it if you came back and broke my windows anyway. And the kids look at him and say, why would we break your windows for free? And they leave and never come back. What's basically happened here is these kids fell prey to the overjustification effect. These kids initially really liked breaking this guy's windows just for the intrinsic value of it. But as soon as they started to get paid for it, as soon as they started to get money for it, the kids started to mistakenly believe that the only reason they were breaking windows was for the money. So therefore, when the man withdrew that money, withdrew that extrinsic reward, the kids came to the conclusion that, wait a second, why would I break your windows, right? They came to the conclusion that because they were only breaking the windows for these extrinsic reasons. So if those extrinsic reasons weren't there, they decided they didn't want to do it anymore. Okay, so that's using a little bit of social psychology to trick the kids into not breaking their windows. Is there any way of avoiding that mindset, of making that mistaken attribution? It's tricky, right? The idea is that if you are aware of the overjustification effect, then that should help you break out of it, right? You can start to realize that, hey, wait a sec, this one activity that I really liked doing, and then I started getting paid for it, maybe I still really like doing it, even if I'm not getting a reward for it. There are a number of implications of this. Okay, I think that one of the, you know, if we're a parent, I think that we really want our kids to do well in school, right? And one of the obvious ways that we might come up with for how to help our kids or how to encourage them to do well in school is to reward them if they bring home a good report card with all A's, say. And so I think a lot of parents might do that. So a kid comes home with a report card of all A's and the parent rewards the child. Okay, well, it seems to make sense, right? But here's the problem. What they might be doing is accidentally creating the overjustification effect. Because from the kid's perspective, what's happening is they start to think, well, the only reason I'm getting good grades is for the reward. They're going to attribute the reason for getting good grades to the reward, as opposed to because it's an intrinsically motivating thing to do on its own to do well in school. So the kids start thinking the only reason they're getting good grades is for the reward. But at some point, the parents are going to have to stop rewarding their kids. Their kids are going to go off to college or something, right? And the kids aren't going to get rewarded every time they get a good grade in a college course. But now, if the kids fell prey to the overjustification effect and they were thinking the only reason they were getting good grades is because of the reward, and they're not getting rewarded anymore, then what's the point of getting good grades? That's the conclusion they may come to. And so what, as a parent, if you reward your kid every time they get a good grade, you might be accidentally that strategy might accidentally backfire. You might be creating the overjustification effect. Note, however, that it's okay to give an unexpected reward. In the markers example, the kids who got an unexpected reward, they didn't lose their intrinsic motivation, right? So I'm not saying you should never reward your kids for anything good. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. You can do so in an unexpected fashion. The danger is only if the kids start expecting that reward, then they can mistakenly start thinking they're only doing it for that reward. I would actually argue, in fact, that the whole way in which grades work in the modern education system creates the overjustification effect itself. Okay? Because what's happened is that through your lifetimes, every time you go to school, you get rewarded with grades. The grades are the reward, in a sense. Now, when you go to school, really the purpose of school is not to get good grades. The purpose of school is to learn. But because you've continually been receiving this extrinsic reward in terms of the grades, you started to mistakenly believe that the only reason to do anything well in school is to get the grade. So if I were to give a lecture, let's say I were to give a lecture tomorrow, and none of the material I cover tomorrow is going to be on an exam, you're not going to be graded on it, it doesn't matter at all for your grades. I would highly suspect that very few, if any of you, would show up to that lecture. But why not? Well, because what you're concerned with, and what I think you've been trained over the course of many, many years, is to think that the reason you learn is to get the good grade, instead of just learning for learning's sake. But that motivation has often been undermined through this reward system that we tend to have in the educational system, where you get these grades. So I think likely pretty much all of us have already experienced the overjustification effect. Okay, oops. When I was a kid, so we're going back a long time here, but when I was a kid, I was on like a community soccer league, right? And some of the teams were led by coaches where if the team won, then the coach would take them out for ice cream. And I was always bitter because I was never on those teams. I was always on the teams where the coaches wouldn't take us out every time we won, right? So I was always jealous of the teams that got to go for ice cream every time. Now, from the coach's perspective, they were likely doing this as an attempt to motivate their kids to play well, right? But of course, what would happen is that among these kids who started to go for ice cream every time they won, they're going to start to think, because of the overjustification effect, that the only reason they're even trying to win their games is because of this ice cream reward. So the problem is that the next year they find themselves on a different team with a different coach who doesn't take them out for ice cream every time they win. And these kids start to think, well, why would I try to win? Why do I care about playing at all if I'm not going to get this reward for winning? So what these coaches might have accidentally done is they might have accidentally undermined their kids' intrinsic motivation to play soccer, for instance. So I think this is something that, because of all the implications it has, we need to consider how the overjustification effect might influence people. Okay, so just to summarize, we have a natural tendency to make attributions for other people's behavior and for our own behavior. In fact, we oftentimes feel sort of uncomfortable if we don't explain other people's behavior in some way. I mean, we saw this before when we looked at the problems with introspection, is that if I ask you, why do you like something? Why do you prefer X over Y? I've shown that people will come up with all sorts of reasons. Not all those reasons are true. Almost no one says, I don't know why I have that preference. We tend to make up these reasons for why we like something. Effectively, this is a reflection of the fact that we feel a need to attribute behavior or preferences to something. So we have this natural tendency to make these attributions. Sometimes we can make rational attributions. That's what Kelly's attribution theory is all about, is that we can, under the right circumstances, combine a bunch of relevant information to come up with the most logical attribution that we can come up with. We can do that. The problem is we don't always do that. Under many conditions, we make sort of irrational or illogical attributions. Our attributions are biased by many factors, including the fundamental attribution error, the active observer effect, the overjustification effect. These are three attributional biases that indicate that the attributions we come up with are not necessarily purely logical or rational all the time. All right, there's about 5 minutes left. I'm going to, well, first off, let me see, are there any questions that anyone has about any of this material? Everyone's good with it? Good. Well, I'm hoping that you're starting to see how a lot of different findings that we've seen so far are starting to integrate a little bit. So the idea that we think really highly of ourselves and the idea that how we make attributions seem to be disconnected. And still we start to realize that part of the reason why we make situational attributions for ourselves is to maintain high self-esteem, right? So we're starting to see that some of the concepts that we're discussing in class are actually interlinked. And we're going to see that as we go through the course. So there's going to be other links between seemingly disparate, different concepts, as we're going to see. Okay, so is there a different version of overjustification like the inverse of it? I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say the inverse of overjustification. However, what you might mean, so, you know, this isn't something I'm going to get into, but there's something called self-determination theory that does say, that does talk about how to increase intrinsic motivation, if that's what you mean by opposite. So self-determination theory is all about how, what factors increase someone's intrinsic motivation to perform an activity. And I can only remember, there's three main factors, of which I can remember two. One of them has to do with the feeling of autonomy. So in other words, to the extent that people feel like they are choosing to engage in a certain activity, as opposed to it being forced on them, that tends to build intrinsic motivation. So children who are forced into a certain sport or activity don't tend to feel that intrinsic motivation, but children who feel like they get to choose that activity tend to feel that intrinsic motivation. And a second factor is relatedness. So to the extent that people, by engaging in an activity that leads people to be able to relate to other people interpersonally, that also tends to increase intrinsic motivation. And there is a third factor that I can't remember off the top of my head at the moment. So I'm guessing that might be what you mean in terms of building intrinsic motivation as opposed to undermining it. So an overjustification, could it be linked to loss of control over your choosing or decision to do something? Yeah, so this is related to some ideas we're going to talk about later on. Actually, someone in my 2 o'clock class asked something relatively similar, where we're going to see that we don't really like losing control over our decisions to do something. We don't like the feeling of being forced into something. And when we feel like we're being forced, or we feel like we're losing the freedom to choose, we'll often react against that. It's a related concept, but it's a little bit different, and I'm going to expand upon that in a later course. But you are getting to into the idea that if you want to build intrinsic motivation in someone, then that person, they should feel like they are choosing to do something themselves as opposed to being forced into it. Okay, so I'm going to post this onto YouTube. I'll send everybody a link for this. And remember that Wednesday's class, we're going to do the same thing over Zoom. And I will see you guys then. Have a good night, guys.